In the fires beneath the world, where the air burns lungs and hope dies in darkness, a slave whispers a prayer. He prays not for freedom, not for mercy, but for the gift of death. Centuries later, in a city hidden by mist that appears on no map, a temple stands half black and half white. Inside, 1,000 faces watch from the walls, the faces of the dead, and somewhere in that hall of stolen identities, a girl from the north struggles to become no one. But between that first prayer in the mines of Valyria and that girl losing herself in Braavos lies a history drenched in blood and shadow, a history of slaves who became the most feared assassins in the known world, a history of men who learned to wear death itself like a cloak. They call themselves the Faceless Men, and their story begins in the deepest hell ever created by human hands. Tonight we trace their entire history, from the burning mines of old Valyria to the House of Black and White, from mercy killings in the darkness to the fall of the greatest civilization the world has ever known. We will uncover how the powerless became powerful, how suffering birthed the most mysterious death cult in existence, and how a religion born from screams in the dark spread across the entire world. But here is what haunts me most. On the day Valyria burned, on the day the 14 flames erupted and dragons fell screaming from the sky, thousands of slaves escaped. They fled across the sea and founded Braavos, the secret city, and the Faceless Men were with them. Did they know the doom was coming, or did they cause it themselves? Before we descend into the mines where it all began, if you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries of Westeros and beyond, take a moment to hit that like button. And here is something that surprised me. 84% of you watching right now are not subscribed. If you love this content, subscribing truly helps the channel grow and lets me bring you more of these epic stories. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is. I love seeing our community spread across different continents and time zones. Some of you are starting your day, others ending your night, all of us drawn to the same dark tales. Now, settle in. Dim the lights if you can. Get comfortable under your blanket. Let the world outside fade away. And let me take you back 3 centuries before Aegon's conquest, to a time when the Valyrian freehold ruled the world with blood and fire. Vaela Morgulis. All men must die. And tonight we learn how that truth became a religion. Our story must begin in 2 places separated by centuries, but connected by blood and purpose. The first place is Braavos, the secret city, the city of 100 islands, rising from the mist-shrouded lagoon in the northwest of Essos. Here, where the Titan of Bronze stands guard over the harbor entrance, where the waters smell of salt and secrets, there stands a temple that embodies perfect duality, the House of Black and White. Half of the temple is carved from black stone, dark as a moonless night. The other half gleams in pale white stone, bright as sun-bleached bone. It sits at the edge of the city, where the harbor meets the lagoon, where life meets death. Step inside, and your eyes need time to adjust to the perpetual twilight. Candles burn in alcoves. The air carries the scent of incense mixed with something sharper, something toxic, poisons being prepared in the chambers below. In the center stands a pool of black water. Those who come seeking the gift, those who want to die, drink from this pool and find peace. But deeper in the temple, past the main chamber, lies the hall that gives you chills even in summer heat, the Hall of Faces. Thousands upon thousands of faces hang on the walls, peeled from the dead and preserved by arts both ancient and terrible. Every race, every age, every expression frozen in time. The faces of kings and beggars, warriors and children, each one a tool, each one a disguise that a faceless man might wear. This is where the Faceless Men operate in the present day. But their true origin lies in the second place, A place that no longer exists. A place that burned 3 centuries ago in flames so hot that the sea itself boils to this day. Valyria. The Valyrian freehold at its height was a wonder beyond imagining. 14 volcanic mountains called the 14 Flames, dragons by the hundreds soaring through sulphurous skies, dragon lord families wielding magic that could shape stone like clay and bend metal with a thought, roads of fused dragonstone connecting an empire that stretched across half of Essos, towers that scraped the clouds. Beauty and horror combined. But beneath this glory, beneath the floating towers and the dragon pits, beneath the palaces built on ambition and blood magic, there were the mines. And in those mines there were the slaves. Hundreds of thousands of them, worked to death in heat and darkness. Digging deeper, always deeper, chasing the veins of gold and precious metals that funded the freehold's magnificence. It was in those mines, in that suffering, in that absolute hopeless darkness, that the faceless men were born, not from ambition or hunger for power, but from something far simpler and far more terrible, from the prayers of the damned, from the understanding that sometimes the only mercy left in the world is death itself. And one man learned to give that gift. To understand how the Faceless Men came to be, you need to understand what the mines of Valyria truly were. And I need to warn you, this part is not easy to hear, but it is necessary. The Valyrian freehold did not build its empire on innovation or trade or diplomacy. It built its empire on the backs of slaves, hundreds of thousands of them, perhaps millions over the centuries, people captured in conquest from every corner of the known world, Guskari warriors defeated in battle, Rosnish water mages subdued by dragonfire, peaceful farmers from the edges of the freehold's ever-expanding borders. Anyone and everyone could end up in chains. And the worst fate of all was to be sent to the mines beneath the 14 Flames. Imagine descending into the earth beneath an active volcano. The heat hits you first, not the warmth of a summer day or even the blast from a forge. This is heat that makes breathing an agony. Every inhale scorches your throat and lungs. The air itself seems to shimmer and warp. Sweat pours from your body but evaporates almost instantly, leaving you in a constant state of dehydration. The deeper you go, the worse it becomes. The tunnels narrow. The ceiling presses down. Sometimes you have to crawl on your belly through gaps barely wide enough for a human body. The rock around you radiates heat like the walls of an oven. Touch the stone with bare skin, and you will blister immediately. Light comes from cracks in the earth, where magma glows red and orange far below. Just enough illumination to see your fellow slaves bent over their work. Just enough to see the overseers with their whips and the guards with their spears. Never enough to see hope. The slaves dug for gold and silver. They carved out precious gems from veins of ore. They extracted metals needed for Valyrian steel and the countless other wonders the Dragon Lords created. Every treasure that made Valyria wealthy came from these tunnels. Every golden statue, every jeweled crown, every fortune spent on luxuries and dragon eggs and magical experiments, all of it paid for in the suffering of those who would never see daylight again. Because here is the truth. They do not teach you in the histories. Most slaves sent to the mines never came back out. They worked until they died. Days, weeks, months if they were particularly unfortunate. The heat alone killed many. Dehydration and heat stroke claimed countless lives. Others died when tunnels collapsed, buried under tons of stone with no one bothering to dig them out. Why would they? More slaves arrived every week. The cruelty was not just physical. It was psychological, spiritual. The slaves came from everywhere. They spoke dozens of different languages. A Guskari slave might labor next to a Sonori nomad, who worked beside a summer islander, who toiled alongside a man from the distant lands of Yeti. They could not communicate except through gestures and the universal language of suffering. Children were born in those mines, conceived in the few moments of rest the slaves managed to steal, born in darkness and heat. These children knew nothing else. They grew up thinking this hell was the entire world. They learned to crawl before they learned to walk, because that is what you do in tight tunnels. They learned to endure pain before they learned to speak. And the Dragon Lords cared nothing for any of this. To them, slaves were not people. They were tools, resources to be used up and replaced. The Dragon Lords flew overhead on their dragons, lived in floating palaces, practiced magic that could reshape reality itself. They were as far above the slaves as the gods are above mortals. Further, perhaps, because at least the gods sometimes answer prayers. But prayers were all the slaves had. When the pain became too much, when the heat stole rational thought, when watching another child die of exhaustion broke something inside you, all you could do was pray. The Giscari slaves prayed to their harpy. The followers of Rulor begged their Lord of Light for deliverance. Those who worshipped the horse gods of the Dothraki plains called out to deities who seemed impossibly distant. The faithful of the Seven asked their gods for mercy. Every religion, every culture, every tradition brought its own prayers into that darkness. And every single prayer, in every single language, no matter which god it was addressed to, asked for the same thing: release, an end to suffering, peace through death. Death became the one thing every slave could agree on. It did not matter if you worshipped fire or water, horses or harpies, one god or 7 or 1,000. Death was universal. Death came for the Dragon Lord and the slave alike. Death did not care about your bloodline or your magic or your dragons. Death was the one true equality in a world built on hierarchy and domination. This is where the seed was planted, in the realization that death and death alone treated everyone the same. But prayers alone change nothing. Crying out to the void brings no salvation. The slaves had been praying for generations, and nothing had changed. The Dragon Lords grew richer. The empire expanded. More slaves poured into the mines to replace those who died. The cycle seemed eternal and unbreakable. What the slaves needed was not more prayers. They needed someone who would answer those prayers. Someone who understood that in a world of such profound injustice, death itself could be an act of mercy. Someone willing to give the gift that all the gods seemed unwilling to provide. They needed the first faceless man, and in the deepest, darkest tunnels beneath the 14 flames, he was beginning to understand his purpose. We do not know his name. We never will. That is fitting, given what he would become. We do not know what land he came from originally or what gods he prayed to before the mines. We do not even know if he was born in slavery or captured in war. All of those details were deliberately erased, because to become the first faceless man, he had to stop being whoever he was before. What we do know is this: he worked in the deepest mines. He heard the prayers of his fellow slaves in languages he did not speak. And over time, surrounded by suffering beyond description, he began to understand something profound. All these different people, praying to all these different gods, were really praying to the same entity. They just had different names for it. The many-faced god, the god who appears differently to every culture but is always fundamentally the same: death. The stranger in Westeros, the Merling king beneath the waves, the black goat of Kuhor, the lion of night in UT, the great shepherd who guides the Lazarene, the horse god of the Dothraki, who rides eternal, rulers opposite, the great other, the harpy's judgment. Every culture's death god was simply one face of the true God, the only God who was real, the only God who came for everyone without exception. And this man, whose name is lost to history, decided that he would serve this God, not by praying to him, not by building him temples or offering him sacrifices of grain or gold, but by becoming his instrument, by personally delivering what all these suffering souls were begging for. He would give them the gift of death, the gift of release from their torment, the gift of peace. But understanding your purpose and acting on it are two different things entirely. Because what this man was contemplating was not heroism, it was not righteousness, it was murder. Taking another human life, even to end their suffering, even at their own request, is crossing a line that most people cannot cross. The first faceless man had to wrestle with this question in the darkness of the minds. If someone is in agony and begs you to end their life, are you a murderer or a savior? If you grant them the release they desperately want, are you committing a sin or performing a sacred act? How do you live with the weight of taking a life, even when that life wants to be taken? These are not simple questions. They have no easy answers. But in the brutal crucible of the Valyrian minds, surrounded by suffering that had no end in sight, the first faceless man found his answer. Death is not evil. Death is not punishment. Death is the natural end that comes for every living thing. In a world where life has become torture, where every breath is pain and every moment is agony, death is not the enemy. Death is the friend, the only friend who offers true rest. And if you can give that gift with compassion, with gentleness, with respect for the sanctity of the life you are ending, then you are not a murderer. You are a priest, a holy servant of the only God that matters. The first faceless man made his choice, and in making that choice, he changed the world forever. The transformation did not happen overnight. It began with whispered conversations in the dark, with building trust among those who suffered together, with finding slaves who had reached the absolute limit of their endurance and had nothing left but the desire for it all to end. The first gift was given quietly, mercifully, a poison that brought sleep, and then a gentle cessation of breathing, no pain, no struggle, just peace. Finally, after years or decades of torment, peace. Word spread slowly through the minds, passed along in fragmented languages and desperate gestures. There was someone who could help, someone who understood, someone who would answer the one prayer the gods seemed deaf to. And the first faceless man learned. He studied which plants and minerals in the mines could be brewed into painless toxins. He practiced moving unseen past the guards and overseers. He taught himself patience and timing, and the art of leaving no evidence behind. Each death had to look natural. Heat stroke, exhaustion, heart failure. If the Dragon Lords suspected mercy killings, they would respond with even greater cruelty. But even as the practice grew, even as more slaves found their release, the first faceless man understood something troubling. This was not enough. Granting death to those who requested it was mercy, yes, but it did nothing to stop the system that created such suffering in the first place. For every slave who found peace, 10 more were dragged down into the mines. The Valyrian freehold continued unchanged, sustained by an endless supply of human misery. To truly serve the many-faced God, to truly bring balance to a world gone mad with cruelty, perhaps mercy alone was not sufficient. Perhaps something more was required. Perhaps the gift of death should not be limited to those who asked for it. Perhaps those who inflicted the suffering also deserved the gods' attention. This thought, this dangerous evolution of purpose, would transform the faceless men from merciful priests into something else entirely, something the world had never seen before. But that transformation required a catalyst. It required someone so cruel, so monstrous, that even the most peaceful soul would be forced to reconsider what justice truly meant. And in the minds of Valyria, where cruelty was commonplace, it was only a matter of time before such a monster appeared. There are moments in history that pivot everything that comes after. Moments where one person's decision ripples outward through time, changing the fate of nations. This was one of those moments, though no one recognized it at the time. How could they? It happened in the darkness beneath a volcano, witnessed by no one except slaves who had no voice and no power. Or so everyone thought. The man who would become the first faceless man had been practicing his art of mercy for months, perhaps years. Time loses meaning in the mines, but he had refined his technique. He knew which poisons worked fastest and which brought the gentlest passage. He had memorized the patterns of the guards, the moments when he could move unseen. He had brought peace to dozens of slaves who could endure no more. But something was about to shift inside him. A line was about to be crossed that would define what the faceless men would become for the next 3 centuries and beyond. The catalyst was an overseer, not just any overseer, but one whose cruelty stood out even in a place built on suffering. History has not preserved his name either, which is probably for the best. Some people deserve to be forgotten. What we know is that he took pleasure in the pain of others. Beating slaves was not enough for him. He needed to see them break emotionally, spiritually. He would force parents to watch their children die. He would withhold water in the burning heat and laugh as people begged. He was in every sense a monster wearing human skin. One night, in the tunnels, this overseer went too far even by Valyrian standards. The details are lost, but the outcome was clear. A slave, broken beyond endurance, cried out not for his own death, not for his own release. He begged for the death of his tormentor. He prayed to whatever God would listen, in whatever language his shattered mind could manage, for the overseer to die, for justice, for vengeance, for someone, anyone, to make the cruelty stop. And the first faceless man heard that prayer. Now, understand what happened in that moment. This was not the same as granting mercy to someone who wanted to die. This was being asked to kill someone who very much wanted to live. This was murder for a purpose beyond ending suffering. This was execution, assassination, the deliberate taking of a life not to bring peace to the victim, but to bring justice to the world. Every moral framework the first faceless man had built was suddenly challenged. He had justified his mercy killings by focusing on consent and compassion. The people he helped wanted to die. He was simply granting them what they asked for. But this was different. This was imposing death on someone against their will. This was becoming judge, jury, and executioner. He spent days wrestling with the question, in what little rest the slaves were granted. In the few moments alone with his thoughts, he turned it over and over in his mind. The Dragon Lord religion said that the noble families had the right to rule because they were superior. The slaves' religions preached justice and righteousness, but their gods seemed absent or powerless. Neither framework gave him an answer he could live with. So he turned to the many-faced God, and in the darkness an answer emerged. Not spoken aloud, not written in fire or revealed in visions, just a quiet certainty that grew in his heart until it became unshakable truth. Death comes for everyone, rich or poor, cruel or kind, slave or dragon lord. This is the one absolute law of existence. No amount of gold or magic or dragon blood can change it. Every person who has ever lived or ever will live will die. It is the only thing that makes us equal. But when someone dies, matters. A child dying in the mines after years of torture lives a fundamentally different existence than a dragon lord dying peacefully of old age after a century of luxury and power. Justice is not everyone dying. Justice is the cruel dying before they can inflict more cruelty. Justice is the powerful being reminded that they too must answer to something greater than themselves. The many-faced God does not judge. Death is not punishment, but death can restore balance. And in a world as broken as Valyria, where the powerful brutalized the weak without consequence, perhaps the greatest service one could offer the many-faced god was to restore that balance. The first faceless man made his decision. He would grant the slave's prayer, he would kill the overseer, and in doing so, he would transform his calling from mercy into something larger, into justice. But there was a problem, a significant one. The mercy killings had been relatively easy to accomplish undetected. Slaves died in the mines constantly from natural causes, but an overseer, his death would be investigated. The Dragon Lords would want answers. They might punish the other slaves. They might bring in more guards, make conditions even worse. The gift of death to one cruel man could create even more suffering if handled poorly. This is where the true genius of the Faceless Men began. This is where the techniques they would become famous for started to develop. Because the first Faceless Man realized that to kill effectively, to kill justly, you needed to become invisible. Not literally, but functionally. You needed to be so unremarkable, so forgettable, that no one would suspect you. You needed to be no one. He began to study the overseer, watching his habits and routines, learning who the overseer spoke to and when, understanding his weaknesses. This was not revenge born of hot anger. This was cold calculation, patient and methodical. The first Faceless Man was discovering that effective assassination required suppressing your own emotions, your own identity. You had to stop thinking of yourself as a person with wants and needs. You had to become a tool, an instrument of the many-faced God's will. And there was another realization, even more profound. To escape suspicion, it helped to look like someone else, to adopt mannerisms and speech patterns that were not your own, to become, for a time, a different person, entirely. This was the seed of what would become the Faceless Men's most terrifying skill. The ability to wear another's identity like a cloak. We do not know exactly how the first assassination was accomplished. The histories are deliberately vague, passed down through centuries of oral tradition before being recorded. But we know it succeeded. The overseer died in a way that aroused no suspicion. Perhaps it looked like an accident, perhaps like illness, perhaps like the will of the gods themselves. Whatever the method, it worked. And the first Faceless Man discovered something about himself. He could live with it. The weight of taking a life, even for just reasons, was heavy, but it did not break him. Instead, it clarified his purpose. He was not just granting mercy to individuals anymore. He was serving a larger balance, ensuring that death came when it was needed, not just when it was inevitable. Word of the overseer's death spread through the mines like wildfire through dry grass. The slaves did not know how it happened, but they knew it had happened. They knew that somewhere among them there was someone who could answer prayers not just for their own deaths, but for justice, for balance, for the many-faced God to take those who needed taking. Other slaves approached the first Faceless Man, at first hesitantly, in whispers, then more boldly. They had names, people who deserved the gift, not just overseers, but dragon lords who visited the mines, slave traders who supplied fresh victims, guards who raped and murdered for sport. A list was growing, and the first Faceless Man began to understand that he could not do this alone. He needed help. He needed others willing to make the same sacrifices he had made, to give up their names, their identities, their very selves in service to the many-faced God, to become no one so they could become anyone, to learn the arts of death in all their forms. The first Faceless Man began to teach, carefully selecting students from among the slaves, teaching them philosophy first, techniques second, making sure they understood that this was not about revenge or personal gain. This was religious service, sacred duty. The many-faced God did not care about your anger or your pain. The many-faced God cared about balance. about ensuring death came when it was supposed to who it was supposed to. They learned to make poisons from the minerals and fungi found in the mines. They practiced moving silently, leaving no trace. They studied the guards and overseers and dragon lords, learning to mimic their walks and voices. They meditated on death, on the meaning of giving up self, on what it meant to truly serve a god, rather than use a god to justify your own desires. And slowly, carefully, they began to kill. Not randomly, not often, but with precision and purpose. Dragon lords who were particularly cruel found themselves dying of sudden fevers. Guards who brutalized slaves fell from cliffs or drowned in underground pools. Slave traders arrived with fresh captives and left in coffins. The deaths were spaced out enough that no pattern emerged. Each looked like an accident or natural causes. The Dragon Lords suspected nothing. How could they? They were the most powerful beings in the world. Who would dare strike at them? And even if someone did, what slave could possibly have the skill to do it undetected? But the slaves knew. And as the years passed, as more joined the Hidden Order, as the techniques became more refined and the philosophy more developed, something was growing in the darkness beneath Valyria. A force that would outlive the Freehold itself. A religion based on the one truth no power could deny. Everyone dies. Everyone must die. And the Faceless Men would be there to ensure those deaths came exactly when the many-faced god required. They were learning patience, learning craft, learning to submerge their individual wants beneath the needs of their calling. They were becoming what they needed to be. But they were still slaves, still trapped in the mines, still subject to the whims of the Dragon Lords. That was about to change, because the skills they were developing, the knowledge they were gaining, would soon be turned towards something far larger than individual justice. The Faceless Men were approaching a decision that would reshape the entire world, a choice that would end the greatest civilization in history and birth a new one from its ashes. But that choice was still years away. For now, they were simply slaves who had learned to kill, and they were very, very good at it. There is a question that haunts historians and meisters who study this period. At what point did the Faceless Men stop being merciful servants of death and become something more dangerous? At what point did their mission evolve from granting individual releases to systematically targeting the powerful? And most troubling of all, at what point did they begin to see the entire Valyrian system as something that needed to be destroyed? The answer is not clean or simple. There was no single moment where everything changed. Instead, it was a gradual evolution driven by logic, philosophy, and the brutal realities of the world they inhabited. But if we had to identify when the transformation truly accelerated, it would be when the Faceless Men began to understand something profound about power. The Dragon Lords were not cruel by accident. Their cruelty was not the result of individual moral failures. It was built into the very structure of Valyrian society. The Empire required slaves to function. The mines needed bodies to extract the wealth that funded everything else. The dragons needed blood sacrifices to remain strong. The magic that made Valyria supreme required human suffering as fuel. This was not a broken system that could be fixed. This was a system working exactly as designed, which meant that killing individual cruel overseers and brutal dragon lords, while satisfying in the moment, changed nothing fundamental. Remove one cruel master and another would take his place. The incentives remained the same. The power structures remained the same. The mines would continue grinding up human lives, whether specific individuals lived or died. The Faceless Men came to a troubling conclusion. To truly serve the many-faced god, to truly restore balance to a world gone mad, they might need to think bigger, much bigger. But before we get to that, we need to understand how skilled they had become. Because in the years since the first assassination, The Faceless men had been refining their craft with terrifying efficiency. They had discovered something remarkable about human nature. People see what they expect to see. A slave is expected to be subservient, broken, invisible, so a faceless man playing the role of a slave became functionally invisible. Guards and overseers looked right through them, seeing only what they assumed a slave should be. This was the beginning of understanding disguise, not as costume, but as psychology. Become what people expect, and they will never question what lies beneath. But they went further. They studied the Dragon Lords themselves, how they walked and talked, the subtle gestures that indicated status and family lineage, the way they held themselves, the cadence of their speech, the mannerisms that marked someone as nobility rather than common-born. And here is where it gets truly disturbing. The Faceless men began to practice becoming Dragon Lords. Not just imitating them, becoming them, adopting their identities so completely that even other Dragon Lords would be fooled. This required more than simple acting. It required understanding the person you were replacing from the inside out. Their relationships, their knowledge, their secrets. It required obtaining their clothes, their jewelry, their personal effects. And most critically, it required dealing with the original person in a way that left a body available. Because the Faceless men had made another discovery, one that would define their order forever. They learned that with the right preparation, with the right techniques borrowed from the very blood magic the Dragon Lords used, you could take a dead person's face and wear it, literally wear their skin and appear to be them. The exact method remained one of their most closely guarded secrets. Some say it involved glass candles and shadow binding. Others claim it required drinking the blood of the deceased and speaking words in the old tongue of Valyria. Still others suggest it was a skill taught by the children of the forest or learned from the priests of the Far East. Whatever the truth, the Faceless men could do what should have been impossible. They could steal another person's identity completely. This changed everything. With this ability, no Dragon Lord was safe. A Faceless man could kill you, take your face, and walk back into your palace as you. They could access your wealth, your knowledge, your power. They could use your authority to issue commands or make decisions. They could destroy you from within while everyone believed you were still alive. The Dragon Lords had ruled through fear and overwhelming power, but the Faceless men had discovered a different kind of power. The power of being anyone. The power of attacking from within rather than without. The power of making the mighty destroy themselves without ever realizing they had been infiltrated. And they used this power, not recklessly. The Faceless men were patient beyond measure. But when a Dragon Lord proved particularly monstrous, when someone's cruelty reached levels that offended even the jaded sensibilities of Valyria, that person might find themselves replaced, their face worn by someone who would quietly undo their worst excesses before arranging a death that looked entirely natural. Imagine being a slave and watching your cruelest master suddenly become reasonable, kinder, less prone to torture and casual violence. You would not know that the person giving orders was not your master at all, but one of your fellow slaves wearing stolen skin. You would simply be grateful for the reprieve, never knowing the truth. But this created a new problem for the Faceless men, a moral weight that went beyond simple assassination. When you wear another person's face, when you live their life and speak with their voice, something happens to you. You begin to understand them, not just intellectually, but emotionally. You feel their fears and desires. You see the world through their eyes, and sometimes you realize that even monsters believe they are justified. The Dragon Lords did not see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as superior beings maintaining natural order. They believed, genuinely believed, that slaves were lesser creatures meant to serve. that the pain they inflicted was no different than a farmer slaughtering cattle. Not cruelty, just pragmatism, just the way the world worked. This understanding did not make the Faceless men more sympathetic to the Dragon Lords. If anything, it made them more determined, because they realized the problem was even deeper than they thought. The Dragon Lords were not aberrations. They were the logical conclusion of a society built on the idea that some lives matter more than others, a society that could only be maintained through violence and oppression. You cannot fix that with individual assassinations. You cannot reform a system where slavery is not an unfortunate side effect, but the entire foundation. The Valyrian freehold, for all its beauty and wonder and magical achievements, was rotten at its core, built on suffering, sustained by blood, defended by dragons that were themselves enslaved through dark sorcery. The Faceless men began to ask themselves a dangerous question. What if the only way to truly serve the many-faced god, to truly restore balance, was to end Valyria itself? Not just specific dragon lords, but the entire civilization, to bring down the 14 flames and everything they represented, to free not just the current slaves, but prevent future generations from suffering the same fate. It was an audacious thought, insane really. Valyria was the most powerful empire the world had ever known. Its dragon lords commanded magic that could level mountains. Its armies were invincible. Its wealth was beyond measure. How could a group of slaves, no matter how skilled at assassination, possibly threaten something so vast and terrible? But the Faceless men had time. They had patience. They had skills no one else possessed. And most importantly, they had access. They could walk among the Dragon Lords as the Dragon Lords themselves. They could learn the Empire's secrets, the weaknesses in its magical defenses, the vulnerabilities in its power structure, the things that made Valyria strong and the things that made it fragile. And they had discovered something interesting about the 14 flames. The volcanoes that powered Valyria were not stable. They required constant magical maintenance to prevent eruption. Teams of blood mages and fire priests worked day and night to keep the forces contained. It was a precarious balance. Remove the right people at the right time, and the whole thing could collapse. Now, we must be careful here. The Meisters debate endlessly whether the Faceless men actually caused the doom of Valyria. Some say yes, that it was the ultimate assassination. Kill not just people but an entire civilization. Others say no, that Valyria's destruction was the inevitable result of hubris and unstable magic, that the 14 flames were always going to erupt eventually, and the Faceless men simply recognized the signs. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Did the Faceless men single-handedly destroy Valyria? Probably not. The forces involved were too vast, too fundamental. But did they help it along? Did they assassinate key figures who were maintaining critical wards and spells? Did they sabotage systems and steal knowledge in ways that made the collapse more likely? Did they, perhaps most damningly, know it was coming and do nothing to stop it while ensuring the slaves escaped? That seems far more plausible. And if true, it means the Faceless men made a choice. They decided that Valyria's destruction was not just acceptable but necessary, that the many-faced god required this massive sacrifice, that sometimes to serve death properly, you have to embrace catastrophe. But whether they caused it or merely allowed it, one thing is certain: when the doom came, when the 14 flames erupted simultaneously and drowned Valyria in fire, when the dragons fell screaming from the sky and the sea itself boiled, the Faceless men were ready. They had ships prepared, they had routes planned, they knew which slaves to gather and how to get them out before the end. Thousands of slaves escaped in those final days, freed from their chains and guided by mysterious figures who seemed to know exactly when to flee and where to go. These refugees gathered on ships and sailed into the unknown, chasing rumors of a safe harbor somewhere in the mists of the Western Ocean. They were guided by the Faceless men. The same slaves who had once only been able to pray for death were now being led to freedom. The gift had evolved from individual mercy to mass salvation, and the refugees, traumatized and lost and grateful to be alive, asked their mysterious saviors what they wanted in return. The Faceless men asked for very little, just a place for their temple, just recognition of the many-faced God, just the freedom to continue their sacred work. The refugees, who understood that they owed these strange priests their lives, agreed without hesitation, and so a bargain was struck that would shape the next 3 centuries. The slaves were free. Valyria was gone. The Faceless men had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, but their work was far from over, because now they had to help build something new, a city that would be the opposite of everything. Valyria represented a place where the former slaves could live without fear of dragons or chains. They sailed west together, refugees and assassins, toward a destination most of them did not even know existed yet, toward a lagoon hidden in mist where a new city would rise, a secret city, a free city, a city that would become the greatest in the world. They were sailing toward Bravos, and nothing would ever be the same again. The signs began months before the doom, small things that most people dismissed, but the Faceless men noticed the earth trembling more frequently beneath the mines, the heat intensifying even in areas that had been stable for decades, dragons becoming agitated and refusing to fly over certain parts of the freehold, blood mages reporting that their spells required more sacrifice than usual to maintain the same effects. The 14 flames glowing brighter at night, visible from miles away like angry gods demanding attention. The Dragon Lords ignored these warnings, or perhaps they simply could not conceive of a world where their power had limits. They had ruled for thousands of years. Their magic had reshaped continents. Their dragons had conquered everyone who dared oppose them. Why would they believe that nature itself could threaten what they had built? But the Faceless men had learned to listen to whispers that others ignored. They had sources throughout the freehold, slaves who cleaned the temples, reported priests praying desperately to stabilize the flames. Servants in Dragon Lord palaces overheard conversations about failed spells and weakening wards. Miners working the deepest tunnels felt the rock itself becoming unstable, shifting in ways it never had before. And the Faceless men, who had perhaps contributed to these failures by removing key figures at critical moments, understood what was coming. The 14 flames were going to erupt, not in years or decades, soon, maybe weeks, maybe days. They made their preparations quietly. Ships were acquired through intermediaries and proxies, not Valyrian vessels with their distinctive dragon-bone hulls, but sturdy trading ships from Volantis and Pentos and the Free Cities, ships that could hold hundreds of people and survive rough seas, ships that would not be immediately identified as stolen property when they fled. Food and water were stockpiled, medical supplies gathered, navigational charts copied from Dragonlord libraries by Faceless men wearing stolen faces, everything done with such careful subtlety that no one noticed the pattern, just normal trade and commerce, nothing to alarm the authorities. Then came the hard part, deciding who to save, because they could not save everyone. There were hundreds of thousands of slaves throughout the freehold. The Faceless men had perhaps 24 ships. They could take maybe 5,000 people if they packed them in dangerously tight. 5,000 out of hundreds of thousands. How do you choose? The Faceless men developed criteria. They prioritized the mines first, the people who had suffered most. They selected families with children, giving the young a chance at life in freedom. They chose people with useful skills, shipwrights and craftsmen, farmers who knew how to coax food from difficult soil, healers and teachers, people who could help build whatever came next. But they also saved people simply because they deserved saving. The old woman who had kept hope alive in the darkest tunnels through her songs. The young man who had shared his meager food with those weaker than himself. The mother who had protected children who were not her own. Acts of kindness and humanity in a place designed to crush both. The faceless men moved through the slave quarters in the final days, whispering instructions. Be ready to move at a moment's notice. Bring nothing you cannot carry. Tell no one outside your immediate family. Trust us and live. Ignore us and die. Most believed because they recognized these mysterious figures, the ones who had granted mercy and brought justice. The servants of the many-faced God. If they said run, you ran. The doom began on a day that had started like any other. Clear skies over Valyria, dragons flying their patrols, markets bustling with trade from across the known world. The dragon lords went about their business, confident in their immortality, and then the first flame erupted. Not gradually, not with warning. It exploded with force that shattered mountains. Magma shot miles into the sky. The blast wave flattened everything for leagues in every direction. And then the second flame erupted, and the third, all 14 going off within hours of each other like some vast coordinated destruction. The earth itself split open. Chasms appeared that swallowed entire cities. The air filled with ash so thick that day became night. Temperatures soared hot enough to melt stone. Dragons fell from the sky. Their wings burned away, their magic overwhelmed. Dragon lords died screaming as their palaces collapsed or were consumed by rivers of lava. The greatest civilization in history was being erased in real time. And in the chaos, as people ran mindlessly in every direction seeking safety that did not exist, the faceless men moved with purpose. They guided their chosen thousands toward the coastline. Through the destruction and the panic and the fire, people followed because there was no other option. Stay and die for certain, or follow these mysterious figures and maybe possibly survive. The ships were waiting, crews already aboard, many of them faceless men who had spent months learning to sail. The refugees poured onto the vessels, cramming into every available space. Families held each other as the ships pushed off from docks that were already beginning to crumble. They watched Valyria burn behind them. The flames so bright you could read by them even miles out to sea, the smoke rising in columns that seemed to reach the heavens themselves. Some refugees wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few prayed to whatever gods they had known before, understanding that all gods were one God. Death had come to Valyria, as it comes to all things. The many-faced god had claimed the mightiest empire in the world with the same indifference he showed to individual lives. No amount of power or magic or dragon blood could stand against the fundamental truth: all men must die. And on that day, all of Valyria died. The fleet sailed west. 27 ships carrying the survivors of catastrophe. They had no clear destination. The faceless men had maps and rumors, but no certainty. Somewhere in the Western Ocean, hidden in mists and marshes, there was supposed to be a place where ships could shelter. A lagoon protected from storms and prying eyes. Whether it truly existed or was just legend, they had no choice but to search for it. The journey took months. Supplies ran low. Disease broke out in the cramped conditions. People died and were given to the sea with prayers to the many-faced god. Storms battered the fleet and several ships were lost. The refugees began to wonder if they had escaped one death only to find another. But the faceless men held firm. They maintained order and rationed supplies. They treated the sick and kept morale from collapsing entirely. They had saved these people, and they would not abandon them now. The gift of death was sacred, yes, but so was the gift of life. These refugees represented something new. The possibility of a world without slavery, without dragon lords, without the cruelty that Valyria had normalized. They were the seeds of something better, and they had to be protected. Then one morning, after nearly 4 months at sea, the lead ship reported something. A wall of mist ahead, unusually thick and persistent, the kind that ships normally avoided because it hid rocks and reefs. But the navigational charts stolen from Valyria suggested that within this mist there was passage, a narrow channel between mudflats that led to something larger. They entered carefully, ships moving in single file through waters so shallow that hitting bottom was a constant risk. The mist closed around them completely. No one could see more than a few feet in any direction. It was terrifying and surreal, like sailing through clouds or entering another world entirely. And then the mist parted. Ahead lay a lagoon so vast it seemed like an inland sea. Dozens of islands scattered across protected waters, hills and marshes and rocky outcroppings, freshwater streams feeding into the salt, fish jumping, birds wheeling overhead. It was empty of people but rich with possibility. A blank canvas where survivors could paint something new. The refugees wept again, but this time from relief and hope rather than grief. They had found it. Sanctuary, a place where the dragons could not reach them because the dragons were all dead. A place hidden from the world behind walls of mist and treacherous waters. A place where they could begin again. The ships anchored in the lagoon and people came ashore on the largest island. They kissed the ground and gave thanks to whatever gods they believed in. The Faceless men let them celebrate before gathering the leaders and elders. There was work to do, shelters to build before winter came, food sources to identify and secure, a community to organize from people who had been slaves days ago and now had to learn to be free. The first settlement was crude, tents and lean-tos made from ship canvas, fishing nets thrown together from rope, fires built from driftwood, but it was theirs. No masters to answer to, no whips or chains, no children destined for the mines, just people trying to survive together in a place where they could define their own futures. They chose a name for their settlement, Bravos, in the bastard Valyrian language. Many of them spoke. It meant defiance, or perhaps courage. The translation was imperfect, but the sentiment was clear. This was a place that rejected everything Valyria had stood for, that would build something different from its very foundations. And the Faceless men who had made this possible asked for their reward, a place to build their temple, recognition of the many-faced God as one of the faiths practiced in this new city, the freedom to continue their sacred work without interference. The refugees agreed immediately. How could they not? These mysterious priests had saved them from certain death and guided them to freedom. Whatever they wanted was theirs. The Faceless men chose a location at the edge of the settlement, where the harbor met the lagoon, where life met death. Salt met fresh water, civilization met wilderness, a boundary place, a liminal space appropriate for those who served the god of endings, and they began to plan the temple that would become their headquarters for the next 3 centuries and beyond, the House of Black and White. The first years in Bravos were harder than anyone expected. The lagoon provided fish, and the islands offered some shelter, but this was not gentle land. Winters were brutal with winds that howled across the water and froze anyone caught unprepared. The marshes bred disease that killed the weak and elderly. Food was scarce until they figured out what crops could grow in the rocky soil. Several times, that first year the settlement came close to starvation. But the refugees endured because they had no choice. Return to where they came from was impossible. Valyria was gone, drowned beneath the smoking sea. The water there was poisoned, and the ruins haunted by things worse than ghosts. They had to make this work or die trying. The Faceless men helped where they could. They hunted and fished with skills honed by years of moving silently through dangerous places. They organized work parties and mediated disputes. They had given up their individual identities in service to death, but they understood community and cooperation. These people needed guidance, and the Faceless Men provided it without demanding authority or recognition. The settlement grew slowly. More islands were settled as the population expanded. Bridges were built connecting the larger land masses. Docks extended into the deeper waters to accommodate the ships that had brought them here and would eventually bring trade. The crude tents gave way to wooden structures and then to buildings of stone quarried from the hills. Different cultures mixed in ways that would have been impossible in Valyria. Former slaves from Gears worked alongside refugees from the Roina. People from the Summer Isles shared fishing techniques with those from the eastern shores. Languages blended into a bastard Valyrian dialect that everyone could understand. Gods from a dozen different traditions were worshipped side by side. The one rule everyone agreed on was that there would be no slavery, never again. This became Bravos's first law. No man or woman could be owned by another. Anyone who tried to keep slaves would be executed. The punishment was harsh because the memory of chains was still fresh. These people had suffered too much to allow that suffering to be replicated in their new home. As the settlement became a town, and the town became a city, the question of secrecy arose. Ships occasionally appeared near the mist wall, traders or explorers mapping the coastline. If word spread that thousands of Valyrian refugees had established a city here, what would happen? The free cities were fighting among themselves for dominance after Valyria's fall. Volantis claimed to be the true heir of the freehold and sought to subjugate its neighbors. If they learned about Bravos, they might see it as territory to conquer. The leaders of Bravos, a council of magisters drawn from the various communities, decided that secrecy was essential, at least until they were strong enough to defend themselves. The city would remain hidden. Ships that discovered them by accident would be either turned away or, if they refused, dealt with more permanently. The Faceless Men quietly volunteered for this latter duty. They were very good at making problems disappear. For 111 years, Bravos remained a secret, the hidden city, the city that did not exist on any map. Traders who dealt with Bravasi merchants were sworn to secrecy under threat of death. Sailors who entered the lagoon were given a choice: stay and become citizens or leave and die. Most chose to stay. Why return to a world of slavery and war when you could live in a place built on freedom? During this century of secrecy, Bravos transformed. The population grew as refugees from various conflicts found their way to the hidden city. The economy developed around banking and trade and skilled crafts. The Bravosi became renowned as sailors and navigators. The Iron Bank was founded to manage the city's growing wealth, and through it all, the Faceless Men worked in the shadows, protecting the city's secrets and serving the many-faced god. The House of Black and White rose slowly over those decades, not because the work was difficult, but because the Faceless Men insisted on doing it right. The temple had to embody their philosophy perfectly. Half black stone and half white stone, built together seamlessly, neither dominating, neither subordinate, just two halves of a balanced whole. The black stone was volcanic rock, similar to what had existed in Valyria, a reminder of where they came from and what they had survived. The white stone was limestone from Bravos itself, pale as bone, representing their new beginning. Together they formed a structure unlike anything else in the known world, stark and beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. Inside, the Faceless Men built the hall that would define their order, the Hall of Faces. Every person who came to the House of Black and White seeking the gift, every soul who drank from the poisoned pool and found peace, had their face carefully removed and preserved. The technique was borrowed from the ancient traditions of Essos and refined through Valyrian blood magic. Each face became a tool, a disguise that a faceless man could wear when the many-faced god required it. The philosophy was simple but profound. Death came to all, rich and poor, young and old, beautiful and ugly. The faces on the wall represented that universality, and by wearing those faces, the faceless men reminded themselves that identity was temporary, that the self was an illusion, that truly serving death required letting go of who you were and becoming no one. The temple also housed something else, a collection of death gods from every culture the refugees had brought with them. The stranger from Westeros stood next to the Merlin king of the seafarers. The black goat of Quhor was positioned across from the lion of night from Yeti. The great shepherd of the Lazarene watched over the same chamber as the many-faced gods' other incarnations, each statue different, but all representing the same fundamental force, the end that awaits all living things. Visitors to the House of Black and White found it deeply unsettling. The constant twilight maintained by shuttered windows and carefully placed candles. The pool of black water in the center that promised peace to those who drank. The faces watching from the walls, the sense that you were standing in a place between worlds, where the living and the dead existed in the same space. It was meant to be unsettling. Death should never be comfortable or casual. But for the faceless men themselves, it was home. The place where they trained and studied and meditated, where they prepared poisons and practiced their arts, where they shed their old identities and became servants of something greater than themselves. The House of Black and White was not just a temple, it was a monastery for assassins, a university for those who studied death in all its forms. While the temple rose, so did Braavo's greatest monument, the Titan, a colossal statue guarding the harbor entrance, standing astride the main channel so that every ship entering or leaving had to pass between its legs. It was built over 30 years by the finest stonemasons and sculptors the city could produce. Bronze and stone and iron combined into a warrior god holding a broken sword above his head. The Titan served multiple purposes. It was a guardian, watching for threats to the city. It was a symbol, reminding everyone of Braavos' strength and independence. And it was a warning. The broken sword represented the shattering of chains, but it was still a weapon. Any who came to conquer Braavos would face its wrath. But more than that, the Titan was a declaration. After 111 years of hiding, Braavos had grown strong enough to reveal itself. The Magisters decided that secrecy was no longer necessary. They had ships and soldiers. They had wealth and alliances. They had the faceless men protecting them from the shadows. It was time to emerge from the mist and take their place among the free cities. The revelation was carefully orchestrated. Ambassadors were sent to Pentos and Mers and Tyrosh and the other cities. They arrived with ships full of trade goods and offers of alliance. The message was clear. Braavos exists. Braavos is powerful. Braavos will not be conquered. Deal with us fairly, and we will enrich you. Attack us, and you will regret it. The other free cities were shocked but pragmatic. A new player had entered the game, and clearly had resources worth cultivating. Within a few years, Braavos had established itself as a major power. The Iron Bank became the financier of choice for anyone needing loans. Braavos' ships dominated certain trade routes. The city's neutrality in conflicts made it valuable as a meeting ground for negotiations. And through it all, the faceless men remained in their temple, largely unknown to the wider world. Some rumors circulated, whispers of assassins who could change faces, stories of deaths that seemed impossible. But most dismissed these as legends, the kind of tale people tell to explain the inexplicable. The faceless men preferred it that way. Let people believe they were myth. Let the powerful sleep soundly thinking no threat could reach them. It made the work easier, and the work continued because death never rested. The many-faced god always had need of servants, And in Bravos, in the house of black and white, those servants trained and waited and listened for the prayers that only they could answer. To understand the faceless men, you must understand what they believe about death and identity, because their philosophy is not just justification for killing. It is a complete worldview that shapes every aspect of their existence. The central tenet is simple. There is only one God, and that God is death. Not a god of death, but death itself elevated to divine status. Every culture in the world worships death under different names and different faces. The stranger, the black goat, the lion of night, the Merlin king, the great other, dozens more. But these are not different gods. They are different interpretations of the same fundamental reality. The thing that comes for everyone, regardless of faith or power or circumstance. This makes death the only truly universal deity. You can choose whether to worship the Seven or Russelor or the old gods of the north. You can reject religion entirely, but you cannot reject death. It will come for you whether you acknowledge it or not. In this sense, the many-faced God is the only honest God, the only one that delivers on its promises every single time without exception. From this understanding flows everything else. If death is the one universal truth, then serving death is the highest calling, and serving death properly requires understanding that identity is an obstacle. Your name, your history, your desires and fears and hopes, these are all chains that bind you to self. They make you care about individual outcomes rather than the larger balance death maintains. So the faceless men practice giving up identity, not symbolically, not as a metaphor. They actually work to erase who they were before they entered the house of black and white. This is far harder than it sounds. Human beings are wired to have a sense of self. We define ourselves through memory and relationships and accumulated experience. Stripping all that away requires years of discipline and techniques that border on self-destruction. The process begins with surrender of the old life. When someone joins the faceless men, they fake their own death. As far as the world knows, they no longer exist. Their family mourns them. Their debts go unpaid. Their enemies celebrate or grieve depending on who they were, but they are gone. This physical severance from the past is essential. You cannot become no one while people still know you as someone. Then comes the harder part. Learning to suppress the internal voice that says this is me and that is not me. Training yourself to adopt any role, any identity without resistance. Becoming comfortable with fundamental changes to how you think and speak and move. This is not acting. Actors pretend while maintaining their core self. Faceless men actually become other people temporarily, submerging their original identity so completely that it ceases to exist for hours or days or weeks. The training involves meditation techniques borrowed from the priests of the East, fasting that brings visions and breaks down ego. The game of faces where acolytes practice lying so convincingly that even they cannot distinguish truth from falsehood. Physical training in combat and stealth and the 1,000 subtle skills required to kill without being caught. Language instruction in every tongue spoken in the known world. Study of cultures and customs and the psychology of power. And poisons. Endless study of poisons. The faceless men have mastered toxicology beyond anything physicians or maesters achieve. They know substances that kill instantly and others that take weeks while mimicking natural illness. They understand which poisons leave traces and which are undetectable. They can induce heart attacks or strokes or seizures. They can make death look like accident or suicide or divine judgment. The strangler is perhaps their most famous creation. Crystals that dissolve in wine and cause the throat to close, strangling the victim from the inside. Death comes in minutes and appears natural enough that only expert examination would reveal murder. They have dozens of others. The tears of lice that simulate natural disease. Basilisk venom that causes madness before death. Sweet sleep that brings painless eternal slumber. Each poison is a tool for a specific purpose. Each death is tailored to serve the many-faced god's requirements. But technique alone does not make a faceless man. The philosophy must be internalized completely, and the 3 rules must be followed without exception. First, a man may not kill for personal gain. If you profit from a death, it is murder for hire, not service to the god. The faceless men do accept payment for their services, but the payment is never profit, it is sacrifice. The price is set to hurt the person asking, to cost them something dear. This ensures that requests for death are serious and prevents the faceless men from becoming simple mercenaries. Second, a man may not kill someone he knows. If you have a relationship with the target, personal feelings will interfere. You might hesitate at the wrong moment, or take pleasure in the act. Either way, you are no longer a neutral instrument of death. You are acting from emotion. So targets are assigned to faceless men who have no connection to them. Third, a servant does not choose his victims. The faceless men do not take contracts based on their own moral judgments. When someone comes to the house of black and white and pays the price and names a name, the god has spoken. That person will die. It does not matter if they are good or evil, young or old, guilty or innocent. The many-faced god has called for them, and the faceless men answer that call. These rules prevent corruption. They keep the order focused on service rather than personal agendas. They maintain the purity of purpose that began in the minds of Valyria, when the first faceless man decided to grant mercy rather than seek revenge. The training takes years, sometimes decades. Most who attempt it fail. They cannot fully surrender identity, or they break under the psychological pressure, or they violate one of the rules and are dismissed. Those who succeed become something both more and less than human. More because they possess skills and knowledge beyond normal mortals, less because they have sacrificed the self that makes us individuals. But in that sacrifice, they find something else: peace, certainty, the comfort of serving something greater than themselves. The faceless men do not struggle with questions of meaning or purpose. They know exactly what they are meant to do: grant the gift when it is required, maintain balance, serve death in all its forms. In the quiet hours between assignments, they practice meditation in the house of black and white, sitting in the twilight among the statues of death gods, listening to the silence broken only by the drip of water into the dark pool, feeling the weight of thousands of faces watching from the walls. This is their church and their sanctuary. This is where they remember that all men must die, and in dying find equality. And when the call comes, when someone arrives seeking death and pays the terrible price and speaks a name, the faceless men respond. They don their faces and become other people. They move through the world invisible and unremarkable. They find their targets and grant the gift with efficiency and grace. Then they return to the temple, add another face to the wall if appropriate, and wait for the next call. This is what it means to be a faceless man, to be no one so you can be anyone. To serve death, because death serves all. To understand that in a world of temporary lives and fleeting power, only the ending is certain, and only those who accept that truth can see clearly. There is a common misconception about the faceless men that needs to be addressed. People assume that if you have enough gold, you can hire them to kill anyone. Kings, emperors, even other faceless men. Just name your target and pay the fee. This is completely wrong and misses the entire point of what they do. The faceless men are not assassins for hire in the traditional sense. They are priests who occasionally kill people. The distinction matters enormously. A hired blade will murder anyone if the price is right. A faceless man will only grant the gift when the many-faced god requires it. And determining what the god requires involves a process far more complex than simple commerce. When someone comes to the house of Black and White seeking death for another, they do not negotiate with a merchant. They speak with a priest. Usually the kindly man who serves as something like a high priest of the order, though such titles mean little to people who have surrendered identity. He sits in the temple's main chamber, surrounded by statues of death gods, and listens to why this person must die. The conversation is not rushed. It might take hours. The supplicant explains the history and the grievances, why they want this death, what they have already tried, why the legal systems and social structures have failed to provide justice. The kindly man asks probing questions. He tests the commitment. He looks for signs that this is about revenge rather than true need. He evaluates whether the requested death serves balance or merely satisfies anger. Because here is the truth about the faceless men. They do not accept every contract, not even close. Most supplicants are turned away. Perhaps the person they want dead is not deserving. Perhaps the supplicant's motives are impure. Perhaps killing this particular individual would create more imbalance than it corrects. The faceless men are selective in ways that would horrify a simple mercenary. They care deeply about serving their god correctly, which means refusing far more work than they accept. But when they do accept, when the kindly man determines that this death is appropriate, the next question arises: what is the price? And this is where the faceless men reveal their true nature. Because the price is never what you expect. It is never a simple exchange of gold for services rendered. The price is always personal, always painful, always calibrated to cost you something that matters more than money. A wealthy merchant once came to the house of Black and White, asking for the death of a rival who had destroyed his business through treachery. The kindly man listened to the story and agreed that the rival deserved the gift. The price was everything. Not a percentage, not a large sum, everything the merchant owned. His ships, his warehouses, his home, his savings, all of it signed over to the Iron Bank with instructions to distribute it to the poor of Bravos. The merchant protested. How could he live with nothing? How would he support his family? The kindly man was unmoved. You asked for death. Death is expensive. If your revenge matters more than your fortune, pay the price. If not, leave and accept that some wrongs go unavenged. The merchant left without paying. His need for vengeance was real, but not strong enough to cost him everything. The faceless men had tested his commitment and found it wanting. A noble woman from one of the free cities arrived seeking the death of her husband. He beat her regularly and had killed their eldest son in a drunken rage. The magistrates would not act because he had powerful friends. She had no legal recourse. The kindly man agreed this man deserved the gift. The price was her daughter, not killed but given to the house of Black and White to be raised as a servant of the many-faced god. The girl would be trained as a faceless man, and the mother would never see her again. The noble woman wept. She begged for a different price. Take my jewelry, my inheritance, anything but my child. The kindly man explained patiently that gold means nothing to those who have renounced possessions. Only sacrifice has value. You want your husband dead to protect your remaining children. Are you willing to give up one to save the others? The noble woman left without deciding. She returned 3 days later and agreed to the price. Her husband died a week after that, apparently of a sudden illness. The daughter entered the temple and began her training. Whether this was justice or tragedy depends on your perspective. A young man came asking for the death of a lord who had raped and murdered his sister. The legal system had acquitted the lord because of his status and wealth. The young man had nothing to offer but his fury and pain. The kindly man listened and agreed that the lord had earned death. The price was the young man himself. He would serve the many-faced god for the rest of his life. Give up his name, his family, his future, become no one in exchange for his sister's murderer receiving the gift. The young man agreed immediately, perhaps too immediately. The kindly man told him to think for a month and return if he still wanted to pay this price. The young man returned exactly 30 days later with the same answer. He entered training that day. The Lord died 6 months later in what appeared to be a tragic accident. The young man stopped being whoever he was and became a faceless man. His family mourned 2 children instead of 1. But in his heart, he felt peace, knowing that justice had been served even if no one else would ever know it. These stories illustrate the pattern. The faceless men do not want your money. They want your suffering. They want you to sacrifice something that hurts, something irreplaceable. This serves multiple purposes. It ensures that requests for death are serious. People do not casually ask for murder when the price might be their firstborn child, or their entire fortune, or their own freedom. It prevents the faceless men from becoming tools of the wealthy, who could simply pay gold to eliminate rivals. And perhaps most importantly, it maintains the sacred nature of death. When you pay a fortune, or give up a child, or surrender your own life to service, you are acknowledging that death is not trivial. That taking a life, even a life that deserves taking, is a profound act with profound consequences. You are making a sacrifice to the many-faced God that matches the sacrifice you are requesting be made. There is symmetry in this balance. The same balance the faceless men have been maintaining since the mines of Valyria. But there is another layer to how the pricing works. The cost is not just about pain. It is about appropriateness. The price reflects something about the target and the supplicant. A merchant asking for a rival's death pays in commerce. A mother seeking to protect her children pays with a child. A man wanting revenge for family murder pays with his own identity and future. The sacrifice mirrors the sin in ways that feel almost poetic. This suggests that the kindly man and the other faceless men are not just evaluating commitment, they are interpreting divine will. What price would the many-faced God demand for this particular death? What offering would be appropriate? They are priests reading omens and signs invisible to others. Whether they are actually communing with something supernatural or simply following sophisticated psychology does not matter. The effect is the same. And sometimes the price is refused, not because the supplicant cannot pay, but because the faceless men decide that death should not happen. A king once sent emissaries to the House of Black and White with an offer. He would pay any price they named to kill his rival, another king who threatened invasion. The kindly man listened and then refused entirely. No price would be accepted. The rival king would live or die according to his own fate, not because an enemy paid for his death. Why? We can only speculate. Perhaps the faceless men saw that this rival king was just and did not deserve death. Perhaps they recognized that killing him would destabilize the region and cause more suffering than it prevented. Perhaps they simply did not want to become pawns in a political game. Whatever the reason, they sent the emissaries away without negotiation. The king who sent them was furious but could do nothing. You cannot force the faceless men to work. They serve death, not monarchs. There are other famous refusals. A wealthy woman wanted her young daughter killed because the girl had been born with deformities that shamed the family. The faceless men refused and suggested the woman might reflect on why she valued reputation over her child's life. A merchant prince wanted a competitor's entire family eliminated. Refused. The faceless men grant death to individuals, not dynasties. A priest wanted the leader of a rival religion killed. Refused with the explanation that theological disputes do not interest the many-faced God. But when they do accept a contract and the price is paid, the death happens, not immediately, not on any predictable timeline, but inevitably. The faceless men are patient and thorough. They study their targets for weeks or months, learning routines and vulnerabilities. deciding which face to wear and which method to employ, planning exits and covering tracks. When they finally act, it appears entirely natural or accidental or unavoidable. A dragon lord in old Valyria died of heatstroke in the mines. A merchant in Braavos fell from his balcony during a storm. A king in Westeros choked on poisoned wine at his own wedding feast. A tyrant in the Free Cities was found dead in his locked chambers with no signs of violence, each death attributed to fate or accident or natural causes, each actually the result of faceless men granting the gift. The key to their success is that no one knows when or how or through whom death will arrive. Your most trusted servant might be a faceless man wearing a stolen face. Your food taster might have been replaced. The prostitute you hired might be an assassin. Anyone could be no one. This paranoia is actually a mercy of sorts. If you know the faceless men are coming, but not when, every day you survive is a gift. Every meal that does not kill you is a small victory. You live in fear, but you live until you do not. There is one more aspect of their pricing worth mentioning. The truly poor, those with nothing to give, can sometimes still obtain the gift, not for others, but for themselves. If you come to the House of Black and White and ask for your own death, if your suffering is genuine and your desire for peace sincere, you can drink from the poisoned pool in the center of the temple. It costs nothing but your life. This is the original mercy the first faceless man granted in the mines. This is the foundation of everything else they do. So no, you cannot simply hire the faceless men with gold. You pay with pieces of your soul, with futures and families and identities, with everything that makes life worth living, and in exchange, someone dies. The many-faced god receives his due, balance is maintained, and the faceless men return to their temple to wait for the next supplicant brave or desperate enough to pay their price. This is how the system has worked for 3 centuries. This is how it continues to work in the present day. And this is why the faceless men remain the most feared and misunderstood organization in the known world. Because death is not a service. Death is a sacrament. And sacraments demand sacrifice. 3 centuries after Braavos was founded, a girl arrived at the House of Black and White who would test everything the faceless men believed about identity and service. Her name was Arya Stark, or rather that was the name she was trying to forget. She came to Braavos on a ship from Westeros, carrying an iron coin given to her by a man she knew as Jaqen H'ghar, though that was likely not his real name either. Faceless men do not have real names. They discard them along with everything else that makes someone an individual. But Arya did not understand this yet. She thought she was meeting a friend, someone who had helped her and promised to teach her his skills. What she was actually doing was applying to join a death cult, and she was possibly the worst candidate imaginable. Arya Stark was the daughter of Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, and briefly Hand of the King. She had witnessed her father's execution. She had survived the War of the 5 Kings by hiding and running, and occasionally killing those who threatened her. She had watched friends die and family scatter. She carried trauma that would have broken most adults, let alone a child barely into her teens. And from all this suffering, she had developed something that directly contradicted faceless men philosophy. A list. Names of people she wanted dead. Cersei Lannister, Gregor Clegane, Walder Frey, Meryn Trant, others who had wronged her or her family. She recited these names every night before sleeping. They were her prayer and her purpose. They kept her going when everything else had been taken away. This should have disqualified her immediately. The faceless men do not kill for personal revenge. They do not serve individual agendas. They grant the gift when the many-faced God requires it, not when angry children demand justice. By every measure, Arya Stark should have been turned away at the door. But she was not. The kindly man allowed her to stay. Perhaps he saw potential beneath the anger. Perhaps he recognized that someone who had survived what she survived possessed unusual strength. Perhaps the god had purposes that mere priests could not fully understand. Whatever the reason, Arya was permitted to begin training. She started at the bottom, scrubbing floors and washing bodies of those who came to the temple seeking the gift of death. The Faceless men brought these people to a peaceful room, let them drink from the poisoned pool, and eased their passage from life. Then Arya would clean the corpses and prepare them for whatever rituals followed. It was unglamorous work meant to teach humility and respect for death. She was also given a new identity, Cat of the Canals, a girl who sold oysters and clams and cockles in the streets of Braavos. This was not just cover. This was her first lesson in becoming no one, live as someone else so completely that Arya Stark begins to fade, adopt their mannerisms and speech patterns, think their thoughts, want their wants. Stop being a high-born girl from Westeros and become a common Braavosi child. Arya struggled with this. She could pretend to be Cat of the Canals during the day, but at night she still recited her list. She still clung to Needle, the sword Jon Snow had given her, hidden away where the Faceless men would not find it. She still thought of herself as Arya Stark of Winterfell, the daughter of Eddard Stark, sister to Robb and Sansa, and Bran and Rickon, part of a family that had been destroyed but not forgotten. The kindly man knew this, of course. He could see through her lies, because he was a master at the game of faces. The exercise where you tell truths and lies, while someone reads your expressions and body language. Arya was decent at lying to others, but terrible at lying to him. He always knew when she was being dishonest, always caught her clinging to her old identity. The punishments were instructive. When Arya lied during the game of faces, she was struck, not brutally but firmly. Pain to teach her that lying poorly had consequences. When she was caught thinking of herself as Arya instead of no one, she lost privileges. No food, no rest. Physical discomfort to reinforce the lesson that identity was an obstacle to overcome. But the kindly man also showed patience that seemed almost parental. He did not expel her despite her failures. He kept teaching, kept testing, kept giving her chances to surrender who she was and become what she needed to be. Arya's training expanded. She learned the common tongue of Westeros more formally. She studied High Valyrian and the Braavosi dialect and other languages. She practiced combat with staffs and daggers and her hands. She learned to move silently, to pick pockets and locks, to observe without being noticed, all the practical skills of an assassin layered on top of the philosophical foundation. And she learned about poisons, how to identify them by sight and smell and taste, which ones killed quickly and which ones took time, how to administer them without detection, how to make death look natural. The Faceless men's entire arsenal of toxins was open to her study, each one a different tool for a different purpose, each one a way to grant the gift. Then came the test that nearly broke her. The kindly man took away her sight. Through some method involving a poison that did not kill but blinded, Arya woke one morning unable to see. This was permanent, she was told. Her eyes no longer worked. She would have to learn to navigate the world without them. The cruelty seemed pointless at first. How does blinding someone teach them to be an assassin? But the purpose became clear as she adapted. Without sight, her other senses sharpened. She learned to hear heartbeats and breathing patterns, to smell fear and sickness and lies, to fight using sound and touch rather than vision. She became more aware of her environment than she had been when she could see. She worked as a blind beggar girl, Blind Beth, selling oysters in the markets, and in this role, she learned to truly observe people, not with eyes, but with attention. She heard conversations and noticed details. She understood human nature by listening to how people spoke and moved. She became functionally invisible, because who pays attention to a blind beggar? This period of blindness lasted months, long enough that Arya began to forget what colors looked like, long enough that she stopped being frustrated by the darkness and started using it. And then, after she had adapted completely, after she had learned the lessons the blindness was meant to teach, her sight was restored. Another poison, another morning waking to find the world visible again. But she was not the same person who had lost her sight. She had been transformed by the experience, made more capable and more observant, closer to being no one, though not quite there yet. Her first real assignment came shortly after. A man who dealt in insurance for ship captains. He was corrupt, charging premiums and then denying claims, leaving families destitute when ships were lost. Someone had come to the House of Black and White and paid the price for his death. Arya was chosen to grant the gift. This was different from her list. This was not personal. She had no connection to this man or his victims. This was pure service to the many-faced god, and Arya succeeded. She studied her target, learned his habits, found the right moment. She poisoned him quietly and walked away. He died, and she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt, just the sense that she had completed a task. The kindly man was pleased. She had proven she could kill without emotion, without making it about herself. This was progress toward becoming no one. But then Arya saw a name she recognized. Meryn Trant, one of the Kingsguard, who had killed her dancing master Syrio Forel. One of the men on her list. He was in Bravos on business with the crown, and Arya abandoned her training to hunt him personally. She found him at a brothel, a man who preferred very young girls, a monster by any measure. Arya pretended to be one of the girls he wanted. She got close, and then she revealed herself and killed him slowly, not granting a merciful gift but taking revenge, making him suffer for what he had done. It was everything the faceless men were not supposed to be. The consequences were severe. Arya returned to the House of Black and White, and found Jaqen Hagar, apparently dead. Killed, she was told, because she had stolen a life from the many-faced god. She had killed someone who was not meant to die yet, someone whose name had not been spoken, and whose price had not been paid. She had murdered for personal reasons. The god was owed a life, and someone had to pay. Except it was a test, a lesson. The body was not really Jorgen, but another faceless man wearing his face. And when Arya tried to take the face off the corpse, she saw her own face underneath. A disorienting moment meant to teach her that names and identities are illusions, that there is no Jorgen Har, no Arya Stark, only faces that can be worn and discarded. The lesson did not take, or perhaps it took differently than intended, because Arya made a choice. She decided that she was not no one. She was Arya Stark of Winterfell, and she was going home. She took the skills the faceless men had taught her, the combat training and poison knowledge and face-changing abilities. She reclaimed Needle from where she had hidden it, and she left Bravos, not as a graduate of the Order, but as something else. Someone who had studied with the faceless men but rejected their philosophy. The question is whether this was failure or success. By the faceless men's standards, Arya failed completely. She could not surrender her identity. She could not stop caring about personal revenge. She used their skills for her own purposes rather than the gods. But perhaps they knew this would happen. Perhaps they saw value in creating something new. A girl with faceless men abilities but stark loyalties. A weapon pointed at Westeros rather than serving death indiscriminately. We know what Arya did after leaving. She returned to Westeros. She infiltrated the twins during a feast and killed Walder Frey, not as herself, but wearing the face of one of his servants. She fed him the bodies of his sons baked into a pie before cutting his throat. Then she wore his face and gathered his entire house, and she poisoned them all. Dozens of Freys dead in a single night, an entire bloodline nearly extinguished. This was not how the Faceless Men worked. It was too personal, too driven by revenge. Too much about Arya Stark's list, and not enough about the many-faced god's will. But it used their techniques flawlessly. The face-changing, the poison, the patience, the execution. She had learned from the best assassins in the world, and applied those lessons to her own purposes. The Faceless Men's reaction to this remains unknown. Did they see it as theft of sacred techniques? Did they hunt her for betraying the order, or did they shrug and accept that some students take what they need and leave? We have no record of Faceless Men pursuing Arya, no attempts to reclaim their secrets or punish her betrayal. Perhaps they let her go. Perhaps she was never truly one of them in the first place. What we do know is that Arya Stark represents something the Faceless Men had never produced before. Someone trained in their methods, but not bound by their philosophy. A killer who retained her identity instead of surrendering it. And in keeping that identity, she may have actually proven something the Faceless Men never intended to demonstrate. That you do not have to become no one to master death. That you can be someone, can care deeply about specific people and specific wrongs and still use those skills effectively. That perhaps identity is not always an obstacle. Sometimes it is fuel. Sometimes caring about names and family and justice makes you more dangerous, not less. The Faceless Men would disagree. They would argue that Arya is diminished by her attachments, that she serves her own anger rather than a higher purpose, that she has taken sacred arts and profaned them with personal vendetta. And they might be right. But Arya Stark is alive, and her enemies are dead, and that has to count for something. There are questions about the Faceless Men that have never been fully answered. Mysteries that gnaw at historians and maesters who study the hidden forces shaping the world, and the most troubling of these questions revolves around a single catastrophic event, the doom of Valyria. We have already discussed the possibility that the Faceless Men were involved, but let us examine this theory more carefully, because the implications are staggering. If a religious order of assassin priests actually destroyed the greatest civilization in history, what else might they be capable of? And more importantly, what else might they have already done? The circumstantial evidence is compelling. The timing alone raises suspicions. The Faceless Men emerged in the mines of Valyria, perhaps 50 to 70 years before the Doom. Long enough to build their organization and refine their skills, long enough to infiltrate Dragonlord society and learn its deepest secrets, long enough to plan something catastrophic. We know they had motive. The Faceless Men were born from slave suffering. Their entire philosophy emerged from the horror of the mines. Every principle they held dear was violated by Valyrian society, slavery, hierarchy based on blood rather than merit, cruelty justified by power. The Dragonlords represented everything the many-faced god should oppose. Ending them would not be murder. It would be justice on a civilizational scale. We know they had access. The Faceless Men could wear any face, including the faces of Dragonlords themselves. They could walk into the most secure locations in Valyria without raising suspicion. They could access libraries and magical research facilities and the chambers where blood mages worked to maintain the 14 flames. If there were vulnerabilities in Valyria's defenses, the Faceless Men would have found them. We know they had skills. By the time of the Doom, the Faceless Men had spent decades perfecting assassination. They understood poisons and sabotage. They knew how to make deaths look accidental or natural. They were patient enough to plan operations that took years to execute. If there was a way to trigger the 14 flames, they could have discovered it. And we know they escaped. Thousands of slaves fled Valyria in the days before the Doom, guided by mysterious figures who seemed to know exactly when to leave and where to go. Ships were prepared, routes were planned, the logistics were too organized to be spontaneous panic. Someone knew the doom was coming and orchestrated a mass evacuation. The Faceless Men are the most likely candidates. But knowing all this does not prove they caused the doom, only that they could have and benefited from it. The Maesters who reject this theory point out valid counter-arguments. The doom was not a simple event. It was geological catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. All 14 volcanic mountains erupted simultaneously. The earth cracked open, dragons fell from the sky. The very laws of nature seemed to break. How could mortal assassins, no matter how skilled, trigger something so vast? The answer might lie in how Valyria actually worked. The freehold was not maintained by military might alone. It was sustained by magic, specifically blood magic, that controlled the 14 flames and kept them from erupting. Teams of mages worked constantly to maintain wards and bindings that contained the volcanic forces. This was not secret knowledge. Everyone knew that Valyrian sorcery was what made Valyrian dominance possible. Which means the system had a weakness. It depended on specific people performing specific rituals. If those people died, if their knowledge was lost, if the spells were interrupted at the wrong moment, what would happen? The wards would fail, the bindings would break, the 14 flames would erupt because nothing was holding them back anymore. The Faceless Men specialized in killing specific people, important people, people whose deaths would create consequences. If they identified the key mages maintaining the 14 flames and eliminated them systematically over years, if they stole or destroyed the texts containing critical spell components, if they sabotaged the rituals in subtle ways that would not be noticed until too late, they could have created the conditions for the doom without actually causing the eruptions themselves. It would be the perfect assassination. Kill not through direct action, but by removing the safeguards preventing natural disaster. Let nature do the work while you escape with the victims you chose to save. And if anyone survived to ask questions, you could honestly say you did not destroy Valyria. The volcanoes did. You just stopped preventing them from doing what volcanoes do. This is speculation, of course. We have no proof. The Faceless Men do not write histories or explain their actions, and everyone who truly knew what happened died in the doom or kept silent afterward. But the theory fits the facts better than random chance or divine punishment. Valyria fell when it did for a reason, and the Faceless Men had more reason than anyone to want it gone. Which brings us to dragons, because there is another mystery woven through the history of the Faceless Men, their relationship with dragon lords and their descendants. We know from reliable sources that hiring the Faceless Men to kill someone with dragon blood is astronomically expensive. Not just costly, but prohibitively so. When someone in Westeros supposedly approached the Faceless Men about killing Daenerys Targaryen, the price quoted was beyond anything the client could pay. Some say it would have cost the entire treasury of a kingdom. Why? The official explanation is that dragon lords are difficult to kill. They have protections and guards. They are wary of assassins. They can use magic to detect threats. All of this is true, but it does not fully explain the price difference. The Faceless Men have killed kings and emperors who were equally well protected. They managed to operate in Valyria itself when it was at the height of power. Difficulty alone should not make the price literally unpayable. Unless the high cost is not about difficulty, unless it is about reluctance, unless the Faceless Men do not actually want to kill people with dragon blood and price their services accordingly to discourage the request. But why would they care? They are supposed to be neutral instruments of death. Names and bloodlines should not matter to those who serve the many-faced god. One possibility is guilt. If the Faceless Men did cause or contribute to the doom, they killed thousands of dragon lords and their families. Perhaps they decided that was enough that they had balanced the scales as much as needed, that continuing to hunt the scattered survivors would be excess rather than justice. So they made themselves prohibitively expensive for such contracts. Another possibility is fear. Maybe the Faceless men learned something in Valyria that made them wary of dragon blood. Some property or power that makes those bloodlines genuinely dangerous even to skilled assassins. We know that Valyrian magic involved blood sacrifice. Perhaps dragon lords had defenses woven into their very lineage, curses that would trigger if they were murdered, protections that would rebound on their killers. The Faceless men might charge enormous prices not to discourage clients but to compensate for genuine risk. Or perhaps the most disturbing possibility. Maybe the Faceless men are not done with the Dragonlord bloodlines. Maybe they are watching and waiting, letting the Targaryens and Valyrians and other survivors think they are safe while actually monitoring them for some purpose we cannot see. The high prices could be misdirection. Make everyone think you will not touch Dragonlords while actually maintaining the capability to eliminate them whenever necessary. We simply do not know. But the dragon question connects to other mysteries, like the Iron Bank. The Iron Bank of Braavos is the most powerful financial institution in the known world. It can lend enough money to fund wars. It can call in debts that topple kingdoms. It has agents everywhere and information networks that rival those of any spy master. And according to some sources, the Faceless men hold a key, a literal key to the Iron Bank's vaults, or perhaps metaphorical access to its resources. What does this mean? Are the Faceless men and the Iron Bank partners? Do they share information and coordinate their actions? When the Iron Bank decides to back one faction over another in a war, are the Faceless men involved in that decision? And if so, what are they trying to accomplish? Think about the power this represents. The Iron Bank can destroy you economically. The Faceless men can destroy you physically. Together they have leverage over almost anyone. Kings who refuse to pay their debts might find creditors sending assassins instead of collection agents. Merchants who compete with Braavosi interests might die in convenient accidents. Anyone who threatens the secret city might face financial ruin, followed by mysterious death. This is conspiracy theory territory. We have no hard evidence of coordination between the Iron Bank and the Faceless men beyond the key reference. But Braavos is a city that operates on secrets and subtle power. The idea that its two most dangerous institutions would work together is not far-fetched. It is almost logical. Why would they not collaborate when their interests align? And their interests do align around one central goal: protecting Braavos, the city that was built by escaped slaves, the city that has no king and no slaves, the city that represents an alternative to the hierarchical power structures that dominate most of the world. Both the Iron Bank and the Faceless men have stakes in Braavos' survival and prosperity. Both would act to eliminate threats to the city. Both operate globally with resources that dwarf most armies. This raises the biggest mystery of all. What is the ultimate purpose of the Faceless men? Are they just religious assassins serving death whenever it is called for? Or are they something more ambitious? A force trying to reshape the world according to their vision. Consider what they have accomplished. They possibly destroyed Valyria, ending the age of Dragonlord tyranny. They helped build Braavos, creating a haven for former slaves. They have systematically made themselves essential to Braavos' security and economy. They have spread their philosophy across multiple continents. People from every nation know about the many-faced god, even if they do not worship him. The Faceless men have become a permanent feature of the world's power structure. Is this just successful institution building, or is it deliberate strategy? Are the Faceless men working towards some long-term goal that will not be apparent for decades or centuries? Do they have a vision of how the world should be, and are they slowly, patiently making it real through carefully chosen deaths and carefully nurtured alliances? We can see hints of a pattern. They oppose slavery, evidenced by their origins and their protection of Braavos's first law. They oppose hereditary tyranny, evidenced by their willingness to kill kings and nobles. They oppose concentrations of power that create the kind of imbalance that leads to oppression. Every major contract we know about has targeted someone who abused power or created injustice. But they also maintain strict neutrality. They do not impose their vision through conquest or political control. They work in shadows. They refuse most contracts. They price themselves out of being simple tools of the rich. This suggests they are not trying to rule the world, but to balance it, to be a counterweight to unchecked power, to ensure that even the mighty must fear something. If this interpretation is correct, the Faceless Men are not assassins. They are gardeners, pruning the tree of civilization to keep it healthy, removing elements that have grown too large or too corrupt, making space for new growth. They serve death not as an end, but as a tool for maintaining balance. The many-faced God is not a deity, but a principle. The idea that no one is above mortality, and therefore no one should act as if they are. This would explain many of their seemingly contradictory actions, why they saved thousands from Valyria, but also possibly caused the doom, why they train acolytes in sacred philosophy, but also teach practical murder, why they charge impossible prices for some contracts, but grant mercy for free to the suffering. They are not consistent because they are not following simple rules. They are trying to maintain equilibrium in a world that constantly tips toward tyranny and oppression. Of course, this could all be romanticism. Maybe the Faceless Men are exactly what they appear to be, religious extremists who worship death and kill people for money, disguised as piety. Maybe there is no grand plan, no conspiracy, no hidden agenda, just fanatics who have convinced themselves that murder is holy when done with the right mindset. But I do not believe that. I think there is more happening here than we can see. The Faceless Men have survived for 3 centuries in a world that destroys most institutions within generations. They have maintained their principles while adapting to changing circumstances. They have influenced history while remaining largely unknown. You do not accomplish all that through simple religious devotion. You accomplish it through intelligence and strategy and ruthless commitment to long-term goals. So, what are they planning? What future are they working toward? What role will they play in the conflicts to come? These are questions without answers. The Faceless Men do not explain themselves. They do not justify their actions to outsiders. They serve the many-faced God, and the God keeps his own counsel. But we can be certain of one thing. They are watching, they are waiting, and when the time comes, when the balance tips too far in the wrong direction, when someone becomes too powerful, or too cruel, or too dangerous, the Faceless Men will act. A face will be worn, a poison will be administered, a life will end, and the world will shift in ways most people never notice. Because that is what the Faceless Men do. They are death's servants, and death always gets what death is owed. Always without exception. No matter how long it takes. The mysteries remain, but the pattern is clear. The Faceless Men are one of the most powerful forces in the world, and they answer to no king, no council, no authority, except their own understanding of what the many-faced God requires. That should terrify everyone. But perhaps it should also comfort us, because if the Faceless Men truly serve balance rather than chaos, if they truly oppose tyranny rather than enable it, then maybe they are exactly what the world needs. A force that even the mighty must fear. A reminder that all men must die, and therefore all men must answer for how they lived. Valar Morghulis, And the faceless men are the ones who make sure those words remain true. We have traced the entire history of the faceless men, from the burning mines of Valyria to the House of Black and White, from slaves praying for death to master assassins who shaped the fate of nations, from one man learning to grant mercy to an order that has endured for 3 centuries. What have we learned? That the faceless men represent something fundamental about the human condition. We all face death. We all struggle with identity and purpose. We all question what justice means in a world where the powerful prey on the weak. The faceless men took these universal experiences and built a religion around them. They transformed suffering into philosophy and philosophy into action. They may have destroyed Valyria, or simply allowed it to destroy itself. Either way, they ensured that a civilization built on cruelty did not last forever. They created Bravos, a city where former slaves could live free. They maintained a force that even kings must fear. They proved that power does not only flow from dragons and armies, sometimes it flows from the willingness to become no one in service to something greater. Are they heroes or villains? The answer depends on your perspective. To the slaves they saved, they are saviors. To the tyrants they killed, they are monsters. To the many-faced god, they are simply servants doing what must be done. Death comes to all. The faceless men ensure it comes when it should. Their mysteries remain. We do not know the full truth about the doom. We do not know their ultimate goals. We do not know what role they will play in the conflicts yet to come. And perhaps that is appropriate. Death itself is a mystery. Why should its servants be any different? But we know they endure. 3 centuries after Bravos was founded, the House of Black and White still stands. The candles still burn in the twilight. The faces still watch from the walls. Someone still comes seeking the gift and finds peace in the black pool. Someone still pays the terrible price and speaks a name, and somewhere in the world, a faceless man wears a new face and walks toward their target. The cycle continues, has always continued, will always continue. If you found this journey into the shadows worthwhile, if these secrets and mysteries drew you in, consider subscribing. There are more tales to tell from the world of ice and fire, more hidden histories waiting to be uncovered, more journeys into the dark places where truth lives. Let your eyes close now. Picture the House of Black and White in your mind. Half darkness, half light. The balance that defines existence. Hear the water lapping against the Bravosi shore. Feel the mist rolling in across the lagoon. The Titan stands watch over the harbor, eternal and patient. Somewhere in that temple, an acolyte practices the game of faces, learning to lie and tell truth with equal conviction, learning to be no one so they can be anyone. The path is long, and most who walk it fail. But those who succeed become something the world has never stopped needing. A force that reminds us all of the one truth no power can deny. Valar Morgulis, all men must die. Valar Doha, Iris, all men must serve. The faceless men serve death, and in serving death, they serve balance. They serve justice. They serve the truth that kings and beggars alike will one day close their eyes for the last time and find the same darkness waiting. Rest now. Let the story settle in your thoughts. Let the mysteries drift through your dreams. The many-faced God is patient. Death can wait. For now, there is only peace, only the gentle darkness, only sleep. And in the morning when you wake, remember that somewhere in Bravos, the House of Black and White still stands. The candles still burn. The faces still wait. And the faceless men continue their eternal work. All men must die, but not tonight. Good night.